best if I turned the microphone on, wouldn't I? Take a few steps forward and point to where we can go next with the thinking. It's a literary night tonight, and I'm going to pass a lot of books around or read from a lot of books. This is a very good book. I won't lend it out because it's the kind of book that doesn't come back, and it's the kind of book that you want to reference. It's called Hamlet's Mill, and it's by Giorgio de Santillana and Herta von Deschend. And they were both historians of science, and Giorgio de Santillana was the dean of historians of science of his day. He was the professor from Harvard. She was from MIT. She was a historian of science. And it's a very good book. It isn't a great book, but it's very good. I'll just pass it around and you can look it over. Just for looking at the diagrams, it's an interesting book. The book has as its central thesis that the ancients were not stupid as modern anthropologists and scientists tend to make them out to be. In fact, the ancients were quite intelligent, but that they functioned using a different language and a different paradigm. Their whole world outlook was altogether different. They agree with mysticism in that they claim that the language of the ancients was the language of mythology. That is, that people spoke to each other by telling each other stories. But it wasn't merely a storytelling or a sharing of stories. For them, all of culture, science, art, religion, mathematics, everything came out of myths. It was a universal language of which the stories were just an embodiment. And for part of the thesis of this book is that one of the things that ties together all of the myths and all of the stories is astronomy, astrology. They show that the shifting of emphasis on myths and the emergence of one myth or another or variations in myths are tied together with the precession of the equinox. And they do a very lovely job of doing that. They look at some other things too. They look at trigons of Saturn and Jupiter and a number of other astronomical, astrological superstructures that tie this all together. To do this, they choose the central figure of Hamlet. Only they hardly mention Hamlet at all, and they trace him back through all kinds of myths. They associate the myth of Hamlet with the myth of Samson and such, but primarily they associate it with Amlodhi, who was a Titan, and the Titan that was grim and hard and cold, and he was very clearly a Kronos type of Titan, a very Saturnine kind of figure. And Amlodhi had this wondrous mill, and that this mill, the mill pole kept getting out of its socket. And every time the mill pole got out of its socket, there was a great upheaval in the world, and there were all kinds of catastrophes, and everything in society shifted. They're very right, and remember a few talks ago we talked about we took the Earth and the pole of the Earth, and we saw that the Moon was at the celestial equator, and Saturn was at the that the ladder of the stars went along the pole from the lunar equator where everything was form-like, to the very cold, frigid zones where everything was cold and intellectual, the battle between intellect and feeling. They realized that the pole is the pole of the Earth, the pole of the of Amlodhi, and Amlodhi is the Saturnine figure. They didn't get the whole lot of stars, but they're missing mysticism, and so they miss a lot of really good things. And so they relate all of this. They didn't bring in Chinese mythology because all of Chinese history and mythology is put together in a similar way, that the changing of pole stars was associated with the changing of dynasties. They put this all together in a very, very tasteful way. And it's done quite well. What I'd like to do tonight is sort of a warm-up to what we're going to get to, is to add 2 chapters to Hamlet's Mill, 2 that they didn't go into, and one would be the folk equivalent of Hamlet's Mill. High mythology usually relates to the most abstruse and the most far-fetched and the most rare kinds of ideas, the kinds of things that you can ponder for an entire life. But there are also street versions, such that the same principle that is in the high myth is found in a worldly wise way in the practical myth. A really good example of this, since Shard is here, we have to look at some of that ancient Hindu stuff. Can't escape it anyway. One of the oldest myths and one of the deepest myths having to do with the creation is the myth of the black swan, which is flying through the night. This harkens back to the Orphic cosmogony we looked at. And a black swan flying through the night represents the ultimate of subtlety. It's not even clear whether the black swan is swimming on the waters of space, because it is so dark that you can't see it. And this is the swan that lays the egg that becomes the egg of light, that becomes the manifest creative cosmos. And the whole idea is, just like the Orphics, the whole idea is to show the black swan as something ultimately subtle, so subtle it can't be seen, that even the highest order of spiritual light is still gross compared to its origin, and that the origins of all creativity, in order to maintain that creativity, must always be invisible. Well, the street version of the black swan is the goose that laid the golden egg. You remember the story. Everybody heard it in grade school. This guy gets the goose, and every day it lays a golden egg, and somebody cons him into thinking that, well, you don't have to wait a whole day for a golden egg. If you cut the goose open, you'll have the source of all of that gold, and you won't have to wait, and you'll have it perpetually. And what happens is they kill the goose and have no more golden eggs after that. And it's basically the same story. It's like saying you become materialistic and you look for the object or for the stuff for your values. You lose the spiritual source, which has to remain invisible. And it's put in a really streetwise, it's for, very down-to-earth peasant-like people. Well, the street version of Hamlet's Mill is an old fairy tale. I am going to try to read it, but I'm going to read really fast, and I'm tired. I only had 3.5 hours of sleep last night and 4 the night before. I got a little nap this noon, but I'm not very together. It is called Why the Sea is Salt. I'm sure everybody has heard the story, Why the Sea is Salt, and we'll just read through it really quickly. I'd like to do a complete analysis of it because all of the details are so in line with everything we've been looking at. So this is fluff night tonight. You're going to have 3 different things read to you. Why the sea is salt. Once upon a time, but it was a long, long time ago, there were 2 brothers, one rich and one poor. Now one Christmas Eve, the poor hadn't so much as a crumb in the house, either of meat or of bread. So he went to his brother to ask him for something to keep Christmas with in God's name. It was not the first time his brother had been forced to help him, and you may fancy he wasn't very glad to see his face, but he said, "If you will do what I ask you, I'll give you a whole flitch of bacon." So the poor brother said he would do anything. Oh, those words, when you say, "I'll do anything," you're hooked right then and there, and was full of thanks. "Well, here's the flitch," said the rich brother, "and now go straight to hell." He says, "What I have given my word to, I must stick to," said the other. So he took the flitch and set off. He walked the whole day, and at dusk he came to a place where he saw a very bright light. "Maybe this is the place," said the man to himself. So he turned aside, and the first thing he saw was an old man with a long white beard who stood in an outhouse hewing wood for the Christmas fire. "Good even," said the man with the flitch. "The same to you. Whither are you going so late?" said the man. "Oh, I am going to hell, if only I knew the right way," answered the poor man. "Well, you're not far wrong, for this is hell," said the old man. "When you get inside, they will be all for buying your flitch, for meat is scarce in hell. But mind you, don't sell it unless you get the hand cairn, which stands behind the door for it. When you come out, I'll teach you how to handle the cairn, for it's good to grind almost anything." So the man with the flitch thanked the other for his good advice and gave a great knock at the devil's door. When he got in, everything went just as the old man had said. All the devils, great and small, came swarming up to him like ants round an anthill, and each tried to outbid the other for the flitch. "Well," said the man, "by rights of my old dame and I ought to have this flitch for our Christmas dinner. But since you all have set your hearts on it, I suppose I must give it to you. But if I sell it at all, I'll have it for that cairn behind yonder door." At first the devil wouldn't hear of such a bargain, and chafed and haggled with the man, but he stuck to what he had said, and at last the devil had to part with his cairn. When the man got out into the yard, he asked the old woodcutter how to handle the cairn, and after he had learned how to use it, he thanked the old man and went off to home as fast as he could, but still the clock had struck 12 on the Christmas Eve before he reached his own door. "Wherever in the world have you been?" said his old dame. "Here I have sat for hour after hour, waiting and watching, without so much as 2 sticks to lay together under the Christmas blouse." "Oh," said the man, "I couldn't get back before, for I had to go a long way, first for one thing and then another. But now you shall see what you shall see." So he put the cairn on the table and bade it first to grind lights, then tablecloth, then meat, then ale, and so on until they had got everything that was nice for Christmas fare. He had only to speak the word, and the cairn ground out what he wanted. The old dame stood by blessing her stars and kept on asking where he had got this wonderful cairn, but he wouldn't tell her. "It's all one where I got it from. You see, the cairn is a good one, and the mill stream never freezes. That's enough." So he ground meat and drink and dainties enough to last out till 12th day, and on the 3rd day he asked all his friends and kin to his house and gave a great feast. Now when his brother saw all that was on the table and all that was behind in the larder, he grew quite spiteful and wild, for he couldn't bear that his brother should have anything. "'Twas only on Christmas Eve," said he to the rest, he was in such straits he came and asked for a morsel of food in God's name, and now he gives us a feast as if he were a count or a king." He turned to his brother and said, "But whence in hell's name have you got all this wealth?" "From behind the door," answered the owner of the cairn, for he didn't care to let the cat out of the bag. Later on in the evening, when he had a drop too much, he could keep his secret no longer, and brought the cairn and said, "See, see you, it has gotten me all this wealth. And so he made the cairn grind all kind of things. When his brother saw it, he set his heart on having the cairn, and after a deal of coaxing, he got it, but he had to pay $300 for it, and his brother bargained to keep it till hay harvest, for he thought, if I keep it till then, I can make it grind meat and drink that will last for years. So you may fancy the cairn didn't grow rusty for want of work. And when hay harvest came, the rich brother got it, and the other brother took care not to teach him how to handle it. It was evening when the rich brother got the cairn home, and next morning he told his wife to go out into the hayfield and toss while the mowers cut the grass, and he would stay at home and get the dinner ready. So when dinner time drew near, he put the cairn on the kitchen table and said, "Grind herrings and broth, and grind them good and fast." Serves him right what's going to happen to him for asking for herring. So the cairn began to grind herrings and broth. First all of the dishes full, then all of the tubs full, and so on till the kitchen floor was quite covered. Then the man twisted and twirled at the cairn to get it to stop, but for all of his twisting and fingering, the cairn went on grinding, and in a little while the broth rose so high that the man was like to drown. So he threw open the kitchen door and ran into the parlor, but it wasn't too long before the cairn had ground the parlor full too, and it was only at the risk of his life that the man could get hold of the latch of the house door through the stream of broth. When he got the door open, he ran out and set off down the road with the stream of herrings and broth at his heels, roaring like a waterfall over the whole farm. Now his old dame, who was in the grassy field tossing hay, thought it was time to come to dinner, and at last she said, "Well, though the master doesn't call us home, we may as well go. Maybe he finds it hard work to boil the broth and will be happy of my help." The men were willing enough, so they sauntered home, but just as they had got a little way up the hill, what should they meet but herrings and broth and bread all streaming and dashing and splashing together in a stream, and the master himself running before them for his life. And as he passed them, he bawled out, "Would to heaven each of you had 100 throats, but take care you're not drowned in the broth." And he went away as though the evil one were at his heels to his brother's house, and begged him for God's sake to take back the cairn that instant. "For," said he, "if it grinds only 1 hour more, the whole parish will be swallowed up by herrings and broth." But his brother wouldn't hear of taking it back till the other paid him $300 more. So the poor brother got both the money and the cairn, and it wasn't long before he set up a farmhouse far finer than the one in which he'd lived. And with the cairn he ground out so much gold that he covered it with plates of gold, and as the farm lay beside the sea, the gold house gleamed and glistened far away over the sea. All who sailed by put ashore to see the man in the golden house and see the wonderful cairn, the fame of which spread far and wide, till there was nobody who hadn't heard of it. So one day there came a skipper who wanted to see the cairn, and the first thing he asked was if it could grind salt. "Grind salt," said the owner. "I should think it could. It can grind anything." When the skipper heard that, he said he must have the cairn, cost what it would, for if he only had it, he thought he would be rid of his long voyages across the stormy seas for a lading of salt. Well, after the first man wouldn't hear of parting with the cairn, the skipper begged and prayed so hard that at last he gave it to him, but he had to pay many thousands of dollars for it. Now, when the skipper had got the cairn on his back, he soon made off with it, for he was afraid lest the man should change his mind. So he had no time to ask how to handle the cairn, but got on board his ship as fast as he could and set sail. When he sailed off a good way, he put the cairn on the deck and said, "Grind salt, both good and fast." Well, the cairn began to grind salt so that it poured out like water, and when the skipper had got the ship full, he wished to stop the cairn, but whichever way he turned it and however much he tried, it was no good. The cairn kept grinding on, and the heap of salt grew higher and higher, and at last down sunk the ship. There lies the cairn at the bottom of the sea, and it grinds away at this very day, and that's why the sea is salt. Not a really heavy little thing. It's clearly the underworld, which can be taken in many ways. It can be taken in the Dante sense, the world that is under and beneath this world. which, as we saw last year, is the world of Hel, H-E-L, the goddess of light that lived in the underworld. It can be seen that this world is the underworld where we live in a world of materialism and illusion. And it takes place at Christmas Eve when St. Nicholas, who is described as a Saturn-like man until he gets converted into the Jupiter who brings all the Christmas gifts, when one is open to see through the earth into its interpenetrability and see the midnight sun right through the center of the earth. So the light image is there, and obviously the Christmas season is the time of initiation. We won't go into all of those things. We could look at all of those, and there would be a lot of meanings we could draw out of it, and each little detail is highly, highly significant. But I just wanted to show that there is a relationship between the folk tale and the great Amlodi's mill. Now, Amlodi's millstone has to be the ecliptic, which before our fall into materialism and into our selfishness used to grind out all the wonders of destiny. We were indeed in a Garden of Eden, in many gardens of Eden previous to our fall. And the gods that worked through the forces of the zodiac brought us one wonder after another, and we were taken care of completely. However, when we fell, we lost the word of power, which we've been talking about for 2 talks now. We've been talking about the word of creative power that the primordial Adam had, the word of power that named the animals, which before we fell into materialism, our creative centers, the larynx and the genitalia, were one center. And we were not divided between maintaining the physical body and doing inward spiritual work. We were unified, and we had the world of power that we were divine and we could create things. We weren't fully conscious yet that we could be godly creators, but under the instruction of the gods through our word of power, we could focus into this world forms and objects and evolve and transmute them as part of our growth, as part of our work in the world. But when we became selfish, we lost the word because part of the power was turned downward. And we entered into the material world with such a high degree of selfishness that we became blind and we had only the material world. And it's very clear that since then we have been selfish and we've been working out of harmony with the principles of nature. And the consequence is that when we produce something out of harmony with such a big, powerful, rhythmic, flowing harmony, we get caught in the discord or the dissonance with the general harmony. And now what the millstone grinds out is the fruits of sin and suffering, which are represented by salt. Clearly, the salt is also the type of character that we develop, or the savor that we develop from these kinds of experiences. So, in a way, the 2 stories are exactly the same story about learning the self-control and not just wanting things, and because it clearly had to be selfishness, because we wanted divine immortality, which is why we abused the creative force in the first place. If we could return to being poor as the poor brother is, we could, blessed are the pure in spirit, the poor in spirit, for they shall see God. And if we could do that, we could return to that word of power, and we could be back in balance again, and things would go right. All right. That's the first introduction. It's going to be all introductions and one epilogue and nothing else. All right. The second chapter that I would offer to Hamlet's Mill is Hamlet itself. Because the funny thing is that for all of the relationship of the Hamlet figure as Amlodi to all of the other mythical figures, to Pan and Samson and a lot of other figures, they do it in a most ingenious way, only they don't delineate it all for you. They let you make the leaps, and when you make this is much more engaging reading. It's quite sophisticated things when you it's quite a sophisticated writing when you have to make the leaps and do the jumps, because then you get a chance to fly a little bit. So they didn't talk about Hamlet when they should have. They dealt with all of the triangles and the trigons of Saturn and Jupiter, and they talk about some triangular ideas, not in the way that we've been talking about them, but they talk about the trine figures. But what they didn't realize is the obvious, that the story of Hamlet and the dramatis personae in that story are identical to the members in the story of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. It is, you have the dead king of Denmark, who is invisible, who appears to his son, and the dead king is never named, so he's not only invisible to everyone, but he is unnamed, if that pure of a character, and he appears to his son as a ghost from the underworld. And he extracts an oath of vengeance from him, identically to the way that Osiris gets the vengeance out of Horus. The same thing is asked. The murdered king, he has been murdered treacherously and cunningly by his brother Claudius. Again, exactly the same setup as we have in Isis and Osiris. It is Typhon, the brother of Osiris, who is, Osiris himself is the consummate one. He's perfect in wisdom, he's beautiful, and he does all of these wonderful things, and whereas his brother Typhon is considered slightly malformed, stubborn as an ass, in fact having a red ass's head, ugly brother. But he's murdered by him, and immediately after the murder, Typhon gains the favor of Gertrude, the queen that was married to the unnamed king, and he marries her, and they have a joint relationship where they now rule the kingdom, which is obviously the phenomenal worlds, which we'll be getting back to in a little bit if we aren't there all the time already. What happens then is Hamlet goes through all kinds of ambivalence with himself, all kinds of struggles with people who go back and forth, like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. They represent the camp followers that switch camp from Hamlet to Claudius in the same way that the followers of Typhon switch back and forth from Horus to Typhon. Eventually, Hamlet overcomes his ambivalence and he slays Claudius, but at the same time, Gertrude is also killed, which is a slight fact that is a little different from the Isis myth, but ultimately in reality it isn't. So that's the whole story, and Hamlet dies himself just as Horus has fulfilled his activity. Now Hamlet is a very modern play, perhaps the most modern of any that Shakespeare did, because the figure of Hamlet in his neurotic indecision and his ambivalence about whether to act or not act, and the reason that he can't act is because he's all bound up in his thinking, and his thinking is very much allied to the material world, and that grates his own dignity, so that his own dignity is suffused to materialism and the fear of death and all of that. And if you think about it, the modern individual, especially the modern seeker, as a Hamlet Horace, is like that. It's our thinking that brings us to realize that there is a spiritual truth, and that in the living out of that truth that we can indeed become divine. But we're wishy-washy. We think this way and we think that way, and for all of our thinking, we never really accomplish easily. Eventually, we have to. We have to get down and do it. And so the story of Hamlet, if taken as the story of Horace, is very much like what our lives are, and they're very much like the Isis and Osiris myth that we've been talking about, especially the most famous passage from it, which we'll read very quickly, which I'm not very good at reading, and that is very difficult. The very first phrase has to deal with the thesis that we've been looking at all semester: to be or not to be. That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time? Yeah. Trying to read something profound and can't even turn the page. and the wise shall be captured in their folly. I get put in my place every week. The oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a rare bodkin. Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought. And enterprises of great pitch and moment with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. Soft you now, the fair Ophelia. Nymph, in thy orisons be all my sins remembered. It's perfect for everything we've been talking about. It talks about the whole process of the ambivalence in the struggle within even the center of our being, the struggle between self as a divine being and ego as a personal being. There's always an internal argument going on, and the ego seems to want to filibuster its way through. It shows very clearly that thinking is the source and process of becoming. As we have said, in the divine spirit we have will, but the divine spirit is universal. It is something in a state of beingness. The life spirit has light and reception and pure imagination that throws off imaginings so that it can be pure. It never imagines itself, and it is universal. It is the reception of the power of the will of the beingness of pure spirit. These two elements of spirit are pure spirit and universal and cannot be given the name God. It is only when there is a reflection in thought, only when we conceive of the nature of a self, that a being is born, that a God is born, that a self is born. So in the process of thinking, even immaculate conception of ideational thought, even in that, the whole process of being is a process of thought. When the spirit becomes, by throwing off what it isn't, that is by projecting thought into the phenomenal realms, into the region of concrete thoughts or of emotions, feelings, and desires, and finally sentient, vital life and dense form. That is how the process of becoming is carried on. The mind then does not act as a mirror, it acts as a lens, and things are projected into the phenomenal worlds that are almost the exclusive habitat of our current state of existence. That it is then that Shakespeare realizes really clearly that the process of being or becoming or overcoming, where the spirit overcomes its own ignorance, its own fear, its own congealed insecurities that it has put its imaginings on to interface with the unknown, the potential of being, that when it overcomes its own fears, that it is decisive in the battle and overcomes the world of Typhon. So it is a great treatise that Shakespeare has made on the nature of being, or of a being, and thinking. The third attribute of the spirit is thinking. The will to be is the life that accommodates itself infinitely in motion relative to that permanent beingness is. But it is in thinking that things are brought to something complete. An idea is something that can be expressed in a formula. It has an internal structure and an internal limitation, even though the idea might be universal, such as the idea of universal gravitation, or the idea of being able to give birth to something. These are things that have right within them formulae. The myths themselves are grand ideas. They represent formulae for giving birth to our consciousness in being. Clearly, the divine spirit has will. And from that will, there is a wisdom, a protective surrounding wisdom. You might say, out of the goodness of the Father, as the Platonist would say it, out of the goodness of the Father, the love and wisdom of the Mother is born. But it isn't that something comes to be that is resolute, that is the fulfillment of the infinite. The infinite parts of our being, or the eternal parts of our being, need something definite in order to be fulfilled. And it is only when something is brought to an action. And this very clearly Hamlet realizes, that if we get in the process of self-becoming and thinking about ourself to the point that the essential quality of self in acting is lost, then there is not the fulfillment of the spirit. So it's again, Shakespeare is right on the Horace myth, and he's right on the principle of triangulation. Again, the divine spirit can be ultimate in creation. It's perpetually creating. The life spirit is perpetually preserving or embodying and continuously taking that creative power and giving it a formless form in a pure imagination. But when something has been brought to a state of completion, it comes to a state of destruction. And once there is the realization of a self, what Shakespeare calls conscience, which is really more like self-consciousness, once there is a realization of self-consciousness, then there must be a realization of death, because it is not a pure spirit, especially when the work of becoming is projected into the phenomenal world. Everything becomes very deathly until we have gotten to, as we are now, where we are exiled in the material world so much that a lot of people don't even know that they have a thought life or a feeling life, or that there is much sentiency. They just sort of take it for granted, and they think it all comes out of the physical. Most people are blind to the fact, you start talking about invisible worlds, they say, no, you got to talk about the real world. And for them, this is the real world and nothing else. And that is death. When we are in this kind of dead end, or the end of the line materialism, there is nothing but death. We've talked about it in the past, that when we do things by the analysis of thought, we have to kill things in order to know them. The very act of conception is an act of termination, because it produces a beginning, and a beginning has an end. Or put in a simple way, birth is a terminal condition. That because we are born, we must die. So one then is a being and falls into the world of death. I think that Shakespeare's portrayal is quite accurate, in that, in fact, more accurate in some ways than the Isis Osiris that we've been reading by Plutarch. Because when the self is born, the necessity for self to exist requires continuous thinking, continuous acting. That ultimately, when we give up the ghost, when we give up thinking, or talking in the big cosmic sense, then self will dissolve back into the realm of the Divine Father and the Divine Mother. But when one lives as self and really becomes a being, especially in the incarnate sense, then there is indeed, in the act of doing what we must do, or else the cosmos would not continue to grow, there would not be an ongoing, continuous light going more and more into the unknown darkness, unless this act took place. But in the act, there is a death, both of the mother and of the father. And so in Shakespeare's portrayal, when the father is dead and the mother dies, in the same act that Hamlet overcomes, it is very accurate to what is so. So there is a suicide right in our self-becoming, and it is only when that suicide is complete by carrying out our work that we become an accurate portrayal by giving ourselves over to the Father or representing the Father. So, in the play, or in what we've just read, in that soliloquy, there are all kinds of other paradoxes about, dual paradoxes about life and death, and working and dreaming, or waking and dreaming, and all of the phenomenal ambivalences we live through that we could go into, but we just don't have time, even though I would like to. I used to give Shakespeare courses, but absolutely nobody attended, and they were pretty wild anyway. Maybe sometime again. All right. That brings us right back to the Isis story, and we're done with the second introduction. And now all we have to do is very quickly review everything that we have done over the course of the entire year, and it won't sound anything like what we did when we did it, because it will be the conspectus, and it's one of my weaknesses that I can't repeat myself. Last semester we looked at the myth of Oedipus, and we tried to be extremely, extremely fundamental or foundational. We examined the principle of triangulation in the two most fundamental potentials of existence, space and time. We said that they represent endless potential. And we looked at the whole principle of 3 points being necessary to know where you are in space, and we used that to understand location. Location of our conscious being through the process of triangulation. We can only know... Recording, yeah, that's all right. The recordings do come out pretty clear. I've finally got a chance to hear them. Then we looked at the triangulation of time, somewhat in a classical way, looking at the present relative to the past and the future, to discern presence. So we had location and presence. And through the 2 semesters we have been triangulating both potentials, time and space, and location and presence, with our consciousness in being, which is the 3rd triad. And our consciousness in being is where our character comes out. So we're looking at what is classically the way history is looked at, or used to be looked at. We look at the place, because the place is relevant. We look at the time, and we look at the being, or at the person, to understand what goes into waking consciousness. We have said that spirit fills time, and it brings to that presence a character of being. And we said that matter fills space, and it gives a form or a quality of location, and that because there is this reflective projection where spirit projects reflectively itself into the phenomenal worlds, the qualities of spirit as it knows itself from its own past history are reflected as its dream, its creative image that is put onto the unknown in the world, and then in stepping into the dream and living the dream out and interacting the parts that are ignorant or shadowy or unknown in the struggle that Hamlet speaks of, in all the little things that we do day by day, fighting with materials that never work, and they're not never what we want them to be. You know, I don't think there's ever been a painter that's had the paint that they wanted, or a musician that could get the pitches or the tone quality that they desired. And in that struggle is how we come to consciousness, and in the process we transform what we interact with. So that's what we've been looking into. We have no more time to really go very far in that. This doesn't sound exactly like what we've been talking about, but that's all right. To come to the process of awakening, we looked some in the myth of Oedipus, but more of the process of awakening we have been looking at Isis, Osiris, and Horus this semester. Osiris, as we saw, was the consummate but dead invisible brother, while Typhon was the ever-present menace, imperfect and grossly apparent, the red-haired ass. Boy, I'm going to have to collect my thought here. What we have been looking at is we have been looking at Osiris and Typhon as being brothers. And in the same way that Osiris represents the deepest of our spiritual nature, the divine spirit, Typhon represents the deepest of our phenomenal existence, our personal existence, the dense physical existence. And we've been looking at this where the spirit creates in such a way that from the spirit's point of view, as lovely as the dream is, it realizes the illusion in dream and it throws it off. And really, if you think about it, all of the world that we live in, as beautiful as it is, in its illusory nature, if taken as a reality itself or as an ultimate itself rather than as part of a process, it is nothing but excrement. It is excrement. It is the throwing off of the spirit, which helps the spirit to be all the more. It's a process of elimination. It knows that it is not this, and in knowing that it is not this, it realizes what it is. And in interacting with it is not as an illusion, it takes that illusion and extracts the reality in the process of elimination. So our struggle of will is ultimately a great fertilizer. I don't want to use the. So it's clear then that the material worlds are sort of the unbecoming becoming, if you like to play with words like that. We've been utilizing this basic double triangle in order to understand this process of reflective projection. We've looked at the upper part as spirit in time, which both reflects off the mirror and projects through the lens of the mind, and the lower triangle represents matter in space, where there is also an automatic kind of reflective thought, but also a projection as a memory or rethinking where the experience or the stuff of experience in the phenomenal world is absorbed into spirit. There is a very classical name for all of this. In all of this, the spirit involves itself in matter in what is called the materialization of spirit. It condenses its reality as a dream, so there is a materialization of spirit very much in the same way that a lot of animals, such as snails, crystallize their external being right from their own inner being. At the same time that spirit becomes involved in matter as life, there is in matter itself an evolution of form, and that evolution of form is put together with the process of the spiritualization of matter. That is the unknown, or the potential is magically, by us giving our all to the process, is magically known or brought into the realm of spirit. All of this is done by the process of extraction of the essence of experience as soul, which is absorbed by the mind back into the consciousness, and it becomes part of the spirit by the process called assimilation, where the similarity of the experience is related to the parent principle that brought it into existence and brought the new consciousness into the spiritual being. All right, each of these processes is threefold, so that we have, in a way, a threefold body, and we have a threefold spirit that is emanate, that from which the bodies are emanate, and there is threefold soul material or essence coming out of these experiences. We've gone over that, and just a little review. So it becomes enneatic. It's the 3 times 3, or the 9, the sacred ennead of the Platonists, but not quite in the way that the Platonists used it. And if you tie them all together again through the central focus of the mind, it becomes the completion or the divine decad of the Pythagoreans. Again, something that I'd like to go into, but I'm just going to have to race through. So now we're about ready to do the little bit of new material that we have for tonight, and then begin a little bit of tie together. This is a very simplified and a very stripped down expression of what we've been trying to understand all year and what we do day by day, at least when we don't forget ourselves. And when we forget ourselves, we lose consciousness of the process, and we have lost experience, or at least deferred experience that we won't know the meaning of for a long time. And the thing is, if we can be completely conscious, if the evolution of form and the evolution of life brings an awakeness of consciousness, if we can willingly wake up, if we can willingly become little Horaces, we don't lose this, and we can bring this to awareness, or we can accomplish this each moment, so that there's never a loss of waking consciousness. That's what we really have to do. It's not going to be a heaven where there is an enlightenment and that after that everything is all easy. It isn't going to be that at all. It's going to be more and more effort of willing to wake up and waking up. It just isn't given to us. It's work. It happens to be wonderful work, but it is work. All right. We've been talking a great deal this year about the principle of waking up, and doing that by focusing on the center of our being, either by focusing through it in observation or focusing into it in the process of concentration. And that brings us to what we're going to look at tonight, and that is when we concentrate, we bring things to a point. And to understand what we're doing and to feel at home with it, let's look a little bit at everything we've looked at before, but just one little step further. The double triangle that we've been looking at can be looked at in several ways. And we have been talking in the last 2 talks that when we concentrate, one of the effects is that when we get within that concentration, it is as if we focus right through a lens and the light comes out the other side, and we find our consciousness while we're focusing on an ever-invisible center. We produce a radius or a sphere of light, and we are aware of every point in that sphere of light as we are focused into the center. So what we're saying is that concentration automatically leads to meditation, that we can't focus on one thing and focus on it well without having the whole picture. Obviously, if it is a prayer-like concentration where we focus right on the center of all being, the Horus with a capital H, we then become concentric, or we become harmonized with God. All right. When we look at triangles and we look at them in a concentrative sense, we're looking at them in a vertical way. not meaning upright, but in the sense of vertex. And so we can almost throw away all of the triangles and see vertices. And this is a subtle one. The Horus point, where the two triangles meet, is a subtle one because it's actually 2 points become one. It's very tricky. So then, if we look at the triangle, at the model from spiritual mathematics, the classical way is that this is always Osiris. And to the right of Osiris, looking into the heart or the center, is Isis. And this is Horus. Now, the thing is, in the same way we're talking about this principle of polarization and the principle of negation being how something positive is realized. Since the absolute is silence or darkness, and all of that potential cannot be spoken of, in order to get something positive out of it, one must reference it in the negative by saying it's not this. But when you say it's not this, you have said something about what it is. When you say it is something which it is not, you produce an inversion. So in the vertical view of the model, Osiris, as it passes through the center of consciousness and passes from transcendent to phenomenal consciousness, it ends up on the other side, and Typhon is seen at this vertex. Now, this is something that we are not conscious of. This happens all the time. We actually go through a double of consciousness. Because we don't see the world, we see light that comes from the world that passes through the lens of the eye and into the brain. From the brain, it goes into the inner bodies, through the etheric body, and so on, until it passes through the mind into the spirit, which makes the recognition. When the light passes through the eye, we actually see the world upside down. And for an infant, especially an infant that has never been incarnated before, it has to learn. There are some people that have never fallen into matter, and they've never had the world of the senses. Can you imagine what a consciousness, what an experience it is from them? Fortunately, they have the compassion and the sensitivity that they can pick up from the world soul and learn from everybody else's experience, but learning for themselves, well, like such a being was Caspar Hauser. Caspar Hauser was supposedly never incarnated ever before in the dense physical world. And for him to come into the world, he would indeed see everything upside down. It's been done that you give a person glasses that inverts everything so that the ceiling is up there and the floor is down there. It takes a few hours, but then the spirit corrects and you see right side up again. You take the glasses off and then you see reality. It's upside down again, and then you have to wait until you adjust until you see right side up. So in the inversion, the principle of negation becomes a reversal, so that we see all things backwards. So one of the phenomena of reflective projection is that the illusion and the non-reality of the material worlds is not only a contrast, but it is by its limitation, and by understanding that inversion and having to constantly make that correction is the way one comes to understand reality. It's a very tricky business that we are in. And so that if we are in both a concentration of looking at something and accepting it as that reality and watching the whole process, again, I'm right back to the Surangama Sutra, which I gave everybody as an assignment and nobody read. That in that process, I'll lend it if anybody wants it. that that in that process is how we wake up, in that reversal inversion. So Isis and the lower Isis becomes, this is Isis with the horns, remember the headdress with the horns, and this is Isis with the crown, with the starry crown. All right, so we see then by concentration, we understand that if we bring things to different vertices, we understand the distribution of consciousness to come to self-conscious awareness by triangulating and producing the circle. Because obviously in our current state of existence, all of these points of reference, whether we want to call them viewpoints or whether we want to call them seed atoms or whatever, all of these points of references are distributed. They are delineated. Remember, we said last time that everything was produced by a point and a line and a circle, and that a circle was itself the process of triangulation. And in this semester, we saw that that process was the process of the concentration to the point that there was projection in the line that became the circle, or, you just take 2 points in a line and you can just draw a circle like that, and that the whole process of compassing something is that same kind of process. So we could go into the distribution, and I have spent about 2 or 3 years trying to go into the distribution of the Isis, Osiris, Horus, Typhon, Isis points of the triangle by distributing them and seeing what the experience is at each point. That is, there is a quality, there is a viewpoint that comes from the physical, which is our sole responsibility almost now. The statement, yeah, that's the way things are. This is what is, and bringing things to a point in knowing what stuff is our focus through the center or the seed atom or the viewpoint of the material world. That is our activity. All right, I don't want to go into that because it's very, very big. I want to just move on to some ideas because this is your homework for the whole rest of your lives. It is mine. And that is to say that when we concentrate, we automatically come into meditation. And when we automatically come into meditation, we see the same model in a circular form. Whereas the center, smallest sphere is the Horus spheres, circle of activity. Then we have the Isis circle, and then the pure spiritual circle is the, what am I doing here? I'm not thinking, I'm just too tired. Osiris, and this becomes the lower Isis, and this becomes Typhon. So that there are spheres of activity. Exactly where the realm of Isis is, whether it passes into the etheric realm or into the desire world, it's a very complicated topic because the mind is actually a bifocal mind, and at some periods in evolution it focuses to the etheric realm where it is now, and approximately where I tried to draw it, so that Isis runs into the etheric desire world, Typhon into the dense physical, and Horus completely within the mental realm altogether. So this drawing represents, the model that we have is very, very impossible thing to do, because the realm of Typhon, the dense physical, is obviously the smallest. The physical body of God is only where there are planets, whereas Osiris is the largest. And so our example, our model of the double triangle doesn't show that. There are a number of other things that it doesn't show. But it is like looking at the Osiris-Typhon shared sphere of consciousness represents then a reflective struggle where the greatness of spirit meets the smallness and demanding of matter, where in the reflective projection, where the quality of will becomes inverted as the quality of resistance. Everybody has to be thankful for Typhon. We have to be thankful for our physical body and all of the resistance in it, because without that resistance, there would be no new growth in will. Without its ability to hold on and remember, as the things always are, and the potential, the remembrance of that ultra-perfect and unspeakable perfect in the absolute, that memory is what allows it to keep shape. You know, if our body's just puddled away for our lack of concentration, you know, it's because of the realm of Typhon has that quality of resistance as memory. Is a very deep, very, very deep thing. I'd love to go into it. It's something I've never come close to solving in life, and I'm just glossing over something quickly. So there is something in that reflection of spheres. So the divine spirit, or the life spirit, then the spiritual life to continue carrying and expressing the power of the Father, becomes the vital sphere, the sphere of energy that cares for and protects and builds and grows the forms. They are exact inversions of each other. This kind of the preservative life of Isis in the higher sense is such that it, by living, is how it keeps things, keeps the light going. By protecting or by trying to grow in the physical sense, it's constantly extending itself. Like if you look at something like a tree, lots of the tree is dead, and it's always dying. And in order to keep it going, the vital quality keeps expanding the trunk and putting out new limbs, trying to outgrow the deathly quality of the Typhon level. So there is a similarity, but yet there is a reflective inversion. In the same way that the idea of self and the image that we have of ego that we maintain and protect, they are reflections of each other. The ego always tries to pretend that it's God and in its insecurity, but it is only the reflection of God. And so those are the kinds of things we're talking about. Inversion then, and the experience of ego, and the process, like for us, to become resolute as Horace or Hamlet, we have to become humble in the egoistic sense so that the divine nature truly can shine through. There can be no truth about the external world as long as we have a resistance in ourselves, and as long as we're mentally preoccupied with maintaining this self-image of, oh, I am this or I am God. It's only when we become completely transparent by a kind of humility that we allow the light and power of spirit to come through us that we can have an illumination into what the true nature of the material world is. So in this process of interacting with the world, understanding the inversion and appreciating each of the inverted qualities of Typhon, Isis, and Horus is what helps us to fulfill the intent of the Spirit, to not deride these things or not to fall subject to the illusion, but to see them for what they are and to appreciate them for what they are. It is very much as it happens in simple psychology. It's much easier to help someone if you really like them, or if you really love them, or if you really do positive things and you can see the reality of things that is in them. even if it may be a nasty, biting character, to find some positive reality in that is to work with the inversion. A lot of this makes a lot of sense because Typhon then becomes Taurus and Osiris becomes Scorpio. Osiris was the same as the river, and the Typhon Osiris is seen as an active river force, and Typhon is seen as the ass-like Taurus with its stubborn resistance and things in its heels and all of that. The fickleness of Isis is not seen as fickleness at all. It's just seen as a reflection of change that represents a life that is perpetual, not motion, but perpetual flow or perpetual life that keeps on living and living. And the life that lives when it becomes a protective something or another in the etheric realm that makes the forms and cares about them and shapes them into something perfect. It relates to the Isis Mephthys that we've been talking about. And Mephthys is then the wife of Typhon, and the feminine principle is in the perfection of the Anji. All right. I don't want to belabor all of this because I'm tired, you're tired. One little interesting sidelight that comes out of this that I just wanted to mention so that it's something to looking at myths in a whole different way, myths that we've looked at for a long time. The name for Typhon was called Set, which after the Egyptian exile became known as Seth. In that sense, Osiris then becomes king. Cain is the creative brother. Seth is the passive, accepting brother. Abel is out of the picture. We'll come to something like that in a little bit. But the fighting brothers, Cain and Abel, and the fall into matter, or the original sin, or the struggle between them, is seen in a totally different light in this sense. I'd like to go into it, but I just don't have time for going into it because it would get to be a little too much. It even carries into the whole side of things as the stages of the moon, because at the full moon, the Set Typhon is when he distributes and tears apart the body of Osiris, and the full moon is when things have been carried as far to the material completion as they can be taken. The distribution is carried far, and in the new moon, in the dark of the moon, it is associated with Cain and the power and the light of the sun in the invisible again, because this is as invisible as this is visible, because that's how visible this comes to be because of the subtlety of the other end. It's kind of a beautiful thing. And so there is a constant back and forth oscillation, which we have talked about throughout. In the new moon, Osiris reunites with the dead, that is the invisible and gone away and unnamed Osiris. And in the full moon, she comes together with Typhon in that kind of marriage. All right. As we've been looking at the story of Isis, Osiris, and Horus, we have divided it. We have seen that there is a natural division in the story, in that the first part of the story is completely about Osiris, or Osiris and Seth. The second part of the story is completely about Isis, and Isis wandering and looking for Osiris and her travail, and it's also about Typhon. And then the final part of the story is about Horus and Seth. So everything gets grounded, or the earth is the fundamental reference for all three characters, but there is a shifting of consciousness from Osiris to Isis to Horus, from Osiris and Typhon, from Isis and Typhon, and from Horus and Typhon. In this process, we began in the very first talk last fall. We talked about the three gray sisters, the gray, and they had the peculiarity that they had one eye between them. And remember Perseus, when he stole the eye, when we were passing it from one to another, we were talking about all of transcendent spiritual consciousness as well as waking phenomenal consciousness was a continuous process of shifting consciousness from one focus to another to another. Now, doing this and looking at this as shifting consciousness and an inverse parallelism leaves us one more way that we can look at at our model. If we look at Osiris, then you just take and cut the circles off like that. We then have, we always have this. We then have a way of looking at the cosmos in a parallelism. And this helps in the process of passing, and the eye is being passed back and forth from Osiris to Isis to Horus, and then Horus becomes the representation of Osiris, and it passes back and forth in a transcendent sense in the same way, at the same time that there is a parallel battle between, remember the three days battle between Horus and Typhon. The things swing back and forth. For a while, Typhon overpowers and actually homosexually overpowers Horus. And then the energy goes back and Horus wins, and then Isis again. So there is a modulation back and forth into and out of matter at the same time that there is a passing of the eye between the religions of the Father, the religions of the life spirit, and the religion of the human spirit. And so there is a within, without, higher, lower, parallel consciousness that is going on all at the same time as the eye is being passed. And I just want to really briefly, I'm realizing this has been quite fast and light, but I just want to mention that if we look at this in parallels then with the oscillation, which is the word, the lost word, by the way, there is then a parallelism between all the sectors 1, all the sectors 2, and all the sectors 3. And that is to say, if we take the whole of our being, starting with the physical where our experience is, we have a reality that is a reality of life, or vitality that interpenetrates it, because we can live and move and grow, and we can bring things through from the physical. Behind our life or our motion, there are motivations from the realm of desire. And this desire gives us a reason to move and to be autonomous. It is a reflection of the separate self, because the animals and humans, which can move around and aren't planted like plants are, they have the potential of an individual spirit. Finally, behind the desire, there are thoughts. And these thoughts have a reason or a meaning. Behind the thought is a manifestation of an idea of bringing something into being. And behind that is within us the same pure conception of being, or the same pure realization of light out of which all concepts are born. And behind that, within us in a transcendent sense, is pure power of will. A goal such that the further we pass into our spiritual being, the more universal we become and the more united and at one we are with the divine. So that there really, in the ultimate sense, isn't such a thing as a separate will. Anyone who can consciously function from the realm of divine spirit and from the will is so united with the will of God that they are not more than an agency. Now, if we want to understand, since the lower mind is coalesced together with the desire for to perform something like a false ego, and the higher self is purely an idea, there is that change of focal length. If we want to understand ego in its desire sense relative to divine spirit, this means that the struggle with desire, the pitting of will and desire is the way, how do you say it? By fighting with resistance. Like if a runner tries to build up muscles by running through water, it is the resistance of the water that allows that runner to build up strength. And it is in the interaction with forms that the inversion of will deals with the resistance of matter. But the becoming to understand the ego nature, it is like it itself feels it is God in its abrogation or arrogation of power to itself, because in a way it is a parallelism of the divine. And the way one overcomes the process of thinking, and that Hamlet spoke of, how do we overcome all of this continuous bothersome thinking, is by will being pitted against the desires. Shakespeare, through Hamlet, didn't say that the reason that a lot of people will suffer all of these things is because they desire this and this and this and this. And we work like crazy because we want things, which is all right, as long as we don't blindly believe that that's the reality. It's all right to desire like that because that's what brings us experience. And in getting that experience, it is the way we have a full life. But in the struggle of will and desire is how we come to develop the realization and power of the Spirit. Desire is obvious. If we're tensing our muscles or grinding our teeth or hunching or something like that, that's desire. Will is something like just a remembrance of that it's going to be this way. It is a faith that when you know the reality of this, so it is the permanence versus the change in the struggle of will and desire that wakes up, and the struggle of will and resistance of form that wakes up the divine power of willing. In a similar way, love has to have something to care for. And in the caring, in the consistency of life, in the consistency of beauty, in the consistency of working something into form and protecting it and caring for it, is the way we come to realize the perpetual light that always brings things to existence. I'm racing through this because I'm not clear, I'm tired, and I don't want this to be a drag. The realization of self as a distinct being as opposed to the dead Isis and Osiris comes about quite clearly by recognizing the discreteness of objects and things. It is because we have a separate form that we are aware of, because when we fell into matter, remember Adam and Eve were ashamed of their nakedness, because in the same time that there was a realization of this is my form, there was also a realization of self. And in that realization of self, it looked at what a piddling thing this really is, and there was a shame of nakedness. And this is why there is that feeling, when we believe this is me, there's nothing more, this is it, that's when we are homosexually overpowered and humiliated by Typhon or Set, is when we allow that unreality of matter to actually become our identity. When we see, I disagree totally with the whole idea of shamanism, because it is nothing but that. People identify with power objects. And it's true that you can focus a lot of energy through a power object, but if you start identifying yourself with a thing, you have given yourself over to illusion. Self is something that should be seen as a perpetual becoming, as a perpetual variation, as a perpetual newness, and something that is perpetually reborn, not the stale old stuff of matter where you're trying to contain more and more of being into it. So I briefly just want to look at that as a way for understanding, again, in a very practical way, what we are doing in our daily lives and how we can take remembrance in the simplest of little things, like my computer that won't work, and I worked all day on it to get it to work, what is actually taking place. So the Issasaic oscillation, or the word, is being in conscious control, and as part of this, we could have gone really into something really refined, because if we take and put all three views together, we have actually the whole cosmology of an expanding and contracting universe, and passing from higher and lower states, even into the collapse, into the center of things at the end. It's a really lovely figure, but it's just too much. And we could actually dope it out. I wanted to, and I started digging into it, the actual process of the 3 days of initiation, as dealing with the three battles of Horus and Typhon, but there just wasn't time again for it. All right, so we could look at this in 3 dimensions, and sometime I'd like to, because what it then becomes is this becomes the conic sections. When you have the 2 cones like that together, in all of the movements of the planets and heavenly bodies, and even the growth rates and things like that in our body are determined or related to conic sections, and we can relate them right to the Isis-Osiris figure, but I just don't have time for it, and it just didn't work out to be able to do that. When we come to the conic sections, now comes the pitch. It comes to be a reality, and that reality is the hourglass. The pitch is, if anybody ever runs into a true hourglass, pick it up. I'd really like to have a true hourglass, and I would even try to tint one of the glasses so that one glass was red or pink and the other one was white, so that when I turned it over, I would know that things were going from the size this, if he's in a psychosynthesis course. And so, all right. So I'd like to get an hourglass if anybody ever runs into them. I'd even time the classes according to them, but it would probably mean then 2-hour classes, because the first half of the class, and right now I'm being timed by a machine. I'd much rather be timed by the battle of Horus and Typhon. All right. So in the myth of Oedipus, we saw the coming into self when the I was being passed, and there was a grip between the life spirit and the human spirit. Exactly as Madame Blavatsky says, that all initiation begins with Neptune and Uranus, meaning to say when the self realizes itself relative to selfness, or in the phenomenal sense, the relationship of Horus to Isis, that is the relationship of the struggle of the desire body and the vital body, out of which the life spirit and human spirit consciousness is developed. So we looked at that. And in this case, we have looked at the not the battle of self, not self, or self-other. In this semester, with the Isis, Osiris, and Horus, we have looked at Horus disengaging himself from Isis in order to represent or become the divine representation of Horus. That ultimately a being in its purest sense should represent beingness. And we have looked then at how the invisible of the Father becomes the magnificence of a self, of a God, of a human being. And we see that in the relationship of Horus and Osiris, moving away from the being connected to a mitigating factor and being a very standalone type of quality. By the way, this is all tied together. Remember, in the family, there were 5 born. There was Osiris, there was Horus the elder, there was Typhon, there was Isis, and there was Nephthys. Then we have Horus being born as the union of Isis and Osiris when they were still in the womb, and then when Isis reunited with Osiris when he was dead, we had Horus the younger. Horus the elder represents a proto-self. Horus represents an actual self, and Horus the younger represents an actual sense that has composite qualities, or qualities that have been brought up out of matter and into the spirit. Everybody looks real tired, so I'll just have to begin to just say this is the end of it. So we have looked then at 2 passings of the eye. I was going to want to look at other types of triangles and other passings of the eye, but this is essential enough. I've already had new ideas on all of this. I could carry it further, but I don't think I will. So that's about all I really have to say. That we have in this myth then the realization of the divine being realized in a divinity, and that being done through the process of action, the primary action being the action of thought and of becoming, and that in that process there is a realization of death, which is the inversion of inversions, that true life can't be realized without there being a death. And so Isis and Osiris must both be killed, just as Gertrude and Claudius. Gertrude and the Silent King are both dead so that Horus can live. That this is something that we go through every day. Next year, I am going to do myths of the origin of evil. And if any of you have from various different mythologies stories of how a particular evil was born, or how evil was born in a different culture, I'm very interested in looking into that. I have quite a few stories. Most of them are pretty standard, like the Bible story and the Greek story. Jared's going to give me some from Hindu mythology, and I've got some from Native American astrology, and I'd be very thankful if you would bring in your favorite myths about the origin of evil. What I wanted to do is I wanted to just finish up by reading the whole Isis-Osiris story, but it's about 8 pages, and I think it would be a little too long for tonight. I don't want to end up doing only my own talking, but it's too late to read, because we never did hear end to end the whole story. And that's it. Are there questions? Loads, but none brought to word yet. No, that breaks up the thought forms. Breaks up the thought forms. Silence keeps them better.
When does the class start in the
It'll probably be usually about the 3rd week of September that I start. give a call to the store sometime in there, and I'll get back to you.
You got to come up with a new word instead of vertical or technically.
Yeah.
You need a whole other vocabulary here.
Yeah, well, vertical is in the English language, and that is one of the meanings of it if you look in the dictionary.
What, vertexically?
No, vertically. It's called a vertical motion.
I'm saying you need another word.
Yeah, I know.
I'm saying is I'm coining another word to describe another concept, which is what you're talking about. Vertically is what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's really nice.
I know what you mean, but it doesn't,
Yeah.
I'm saying you need another whole vocabulary because what's happening here is that words are stumbling over each other. I mean, the difficulty of understanding this in less than 15 letters
yeah.
What's the word I want?
I like vertically because it evolves very quickly into vortically, and the two are closely related to each other. Yes, vortexes form around vertexes, and that's a nice metamorphosis. You can't concentrate without starting the big vortex going.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. The prayer wheel starts spinning.
Yeah.
Tapping breaks up thought forms.
Yes.
So how did it start?
I think some thought storms should be broken up because at that moment there is nothing going back and forth between the two people but giving praise to the person who has presented, and that might lead to all kinds of ego and maybe clapping at that point.
The illusion of the performance, that's what it is.